She was the German-born empress of the Russian Empire and would prove to be one of its greatest leaders. Through her, Russia would establish itself as one of the top leaders in European political and cultural life. Catherine continued the work started by Peter the Great by reorganizing the law and administration of the Russian Empire and expanding its territories to the Crimea and much of Poland. Despite these gains, the poor of Russia and the Ukraine would suffer under her rule. Catherine had an unwavering ambition to make Russia greater than when she had inherited it. She embarked on a transformation from a European princess to one of the most powerful people on earth. Russia was transformed into a vast empire under Peter the Great. However, with all this power came great wealth, and with great wealth came even greater inequalities for the poor. While Russia was home to some of the richest people in the world, it also operated as a slave camp for millions of the country's peasant class. Their only function in Russian society was to serve, and they were routinely bought and sold by those in power. In 1741, Russia was ruled by Empress Elizabeth, daughter of Peter the Great. Her 20-year rule was ruthless, but she brought stability to the monarchy and continued her father's legacy. Empress Elizabeth was the last full-blooded heir to the imperial Romanov dynasty, but her grip on power was hard fought for. To further secure her position, she designated her nephew Peter as her heir, as she had no children of her own. Peter took on the title of Grand Duke and married the woman the world would come to know as Catherine the Great. Catherine was born in 1729, but did you know her name actually wasn't Catherine at all? Her actual name was Sophia Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst. Not only quite the mouthful, but guess what? It's also not Russian, as Catherine comes from the German lineage. At age 15, destiny would take her by the hand, all the way from her native Prussia right to the doorstep of Empress Elizabeth, who immediately presented Catherine with the most desirable bachelor of all time, her very own nephew, Grand Duke Peter III, alternatively known as the Drunkard from Holstein. Unfortunately for the young couple, the marriage would not be a happy one. Catherine devoted herself entirely to her new home, quickly learning the Russian language and customs, even adopting the name Catherine and converting to Russian Orthodoxy. On the other hand, the Grand Duke Peter hated everything Russian and snubbed their culture as inferior. Each night, Peter would return to his wife, clothed in the scent of alcohol, incapable of performing the marital duties which would have been expected of him. Whilst Catherine seemed to be taking it lightly, Empress Elizabeth was getting rather desperate for her nephew to produce an heir, which didn't seem likely to happen anytime soon. So along came Chancellor Alexei Bestuzhev, a great diplomat of the time. To do what diplomats do, he said the thing that someone else needed to have said, but wouldn't. The Chancellor informed Catherine that the government had decided she needed to start dating again, and for that, Bestuzhev just so happened to have the perfect candidate in mind, ladies' man extraordinaire Prince Sergei Saltykov. Of course, nobility here and there are always looking for the finest things in life. Food, wine, clothing, the finest granite for their secret torture chambers. Well, when it comes to extramarital impregnation services, it is no different, and Saltykov came along with the highest commendations by none other than the Empress Elizabeth herself, who had, well, curated the man's amatorial aptitudes in the past. This marked the beginning of a long history of affairs for Catherine, who was known to have enjoyed various lovers. Meanwhile, Catherine's significant other, the Grand Duke Peter III, had gotten to the throne of Tsar in the classic fashion of nobility. His aunt put him there. A fact which may or may not have contributed to some of the other flattering monikers the Russian court would know him for, such as the good-for-nothing or simply the idiot. But hey, the game of royalty has always been akin to chess, with invisible hands taking a pawn from here and placing a king there. So let's cut good old Grand Duke Pete some slack. The ones who didn't cut Peter some slack, though, were Catherine's many loving fans, some of whom, as rumor has it, had a hand in fathering Catherine's children. Talk about the ultimate chess move. In 1761, the Grand Duke's auntie, Empress Elizabeth, died, making him the new Tsar of Russia. Peter introduced an arrangement of reforms, including the revision of the land's foreign policy, withdrawal from the Seven-Year War, and other ventures of a worryingly democratic nature. Hey, not bad for the seemingly useless wimp. Peter also ended the war with Prussia, which was interpreted as a gesture of love towards Germany, a big no-no in Russia at the time. Unfortunately for Peter, Catherine was liked far more than him in the public eye. Catherine also had what I would call the booty call factor. Well, that probably isn't a great way of phrasing it, but the point is that she had her lovers, and it would be one of them in particular, Prince Grigory Orlov, who would lead the coup d'etat to overthrow the Tsar, in favor of installing Catherine as the new empress. By the middle of 1762, Peter, Tsar of Russia, was arrested and forced to abdicate. Not long after, he'd be dead under suspicious circumstances. Peter's fall would mark the beginning of Catherine's rule, and right away she started making bold decisions. The former new girl in town wasn't a novice anymore, and would come to be a force to be reckoned with. She made Orlov general-in-chief, as well as other special honors. She then made one of her lovers king of Poland. This move stabilized Russia's western border, since he was completely infatuated with her and would be easily controlled. She then proceeded to secularize the clergy's property, which meant a replenishment of the state's treasury, which had been suffering under Elizabeth's rule. Even though the new empress would live up to the title of Catherine the Great, she also started to have her big, bad failings. Social reform, as we all should know by now, can be a tricky thing, especially in Russia. Catherine attempted to establish a constitution by organizing a congress. She invited delegates from all parts of the empire, so she could better understand the wishes of the people. The serfs, however, weren't invited, even though they make up 90% of the Russian people. These were peasants who worked the land under their masters. They were born into servitude, destined to serve the same landowners their parents served. That is, until they were sold to another master against their will. This system was inhumane, and thus Catherine overlooked a great portion of the populace basically living as slaves, hindering her chances of effecting meaningful change. The following years would be troublesome for Catherine. A terrible plague sprung up in the midst of war with the Ottoman Empire. This led to extreme civil strife, culminating in a huge peasant uprising led by Yemelyan Pugachev, a former Cossack officer pretending to be the dead Tsar Peter III. Yep, you really can't make this stuff up. The rebellion was huge and was only stopped when the rebels threatened to march on Moscow. This mass uprising changed Catherine forever. She realized the people need to be feared, not pitied. Instead of relieving the populace from some of the burdens of their lives in Russia, she doubled down even more. Another notable chapter during Catherine's rule was the war with the Ottoman Empire, an old rival of Russia. It was during this time that a man named Grigory Potemkin would make his entrance on Catherine. I mean, in Catherine's life. But yeah, he would also eventually become her lover. Distinguishing himself from, arguably, most of Catherine's amorous pursuits, Potemkin was regarded as an extraordinary man, one she could bed, respect, and love, all in a single package. It was Potemkin who secured the annexation of Crimea from the Ottomans, thus giving Russia a foothold in the Black Sea, threatening the heart of the Ottoman Empire. Despite such strategic milestones, Catherine made sure to keep Russia out of the European wars. The writer Radashev wrote about the abuses of the empire upon the serf population. This would lead to the man facing trial for treason. Let's say that freedom of the press was not trending in those parts of the world at the time. He was lucky enough to be pardoned, if being condemned to exile is something to be taken as a pardon. Maybe not exactly your get out of jail free card, but at least it kept the blood flowing through the writer's veins. The irony in Radishev's case is that his work was in fact quite in tone with what Catherine herself tried and failed to achieve at the beginning of her mandate. Despite her poor dealings when it came to the serfs and some other questionable decisions, like that of a military coup and a husband who died in scrupulous circumstances, by the end of her mandate, more than 100 new towns had been funded, dozens of provinces had undergone administrative reform, and trade and communications all throughout the land had seen development. But one thing is for sure about that 11-year-old girl named Sophie. She would grow up to become the empress to a foreign land, expand its borders, and become one of the most powerful people on Earth. Although many stories exist about the manner and condition of her death, some of them fantastical and in rather poor taste, it is widely accepted she died of a stroke in the year of 1792. On her will she wrote, "Lay out my corpse dressed in white, with a golden crown on my head, and on it inscribe my Christian name." So, yeah, that's Catherine the Great. What do you think? Was she so great? Is she criticized too much despite achieving so many great things? Let us know in the comments, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Thanks again.